Can I share something pretty obvious but nonetheless quite profound? Yes? Good, thank you. As I navigate deeper into the patchwork history of science fiction literature, a gallery of pioneers, inspirers and influencers is taking shape. The important people, those individuals that done it first, done it best, or simply left a mark on the future. Most of these are household names, authors like H.G. Wells, Mary Shelley, Asimov, Clarke, you know, the people whose name is on the front of the book. But the true architects of the science fiction landscape are those that decide what will be published in the first place, the purveyors of the shop window. As we observe and consume the genre from here in the early 21st century, science fiction has already gone through its adolescence and golden age and is now something so much more potentially convoluted and complicated. But the vision and the business decisions of two men in particular shaped the impact and perception of our current view of science fiction like nobody else. In the 1920s, the American publishing world was enjoying a boom period. Cheap paper, refined printing presses, and the appetite of the public for the short story format combined to fuel the pulp era. For about 60 years, from the 1890s to the 1950s, hundreds of magazine titles covering detective stories, westerns, romance, adventure, even soft porn was the main source of escapism and entertainment. In 1926, a Luxembourger, what do you call someone from Luxembourg?
I don't know.
In 1926, Hugo Gernsback, an immigrant from Luxembourg, now an American citizen living in New York City, launched Amazing Stories, the very first pulp magazine dedicated entirely to science fiction. Hugo's background was in electronics and radio. He even launched a magazine about technical amateur radio building stuff, and he occasionally slipped in a science fiction story. Obviously, science fiction existed long before 1926. We've made several videos about it. I'll leave the links down below. But Hugo's vision for Amazing Stories was to push the harder side of the genre, that technical slice of his brain, and reach for the future. The first few issues just had reprints of older stories, mainly from European writers. Wells and Verne were on the cover of issue number 1, but the mission was always to create something new. So Hugo actively scouted for writers who could give him something more, something fresh and exciting. The public loved it, essentially establishing science fiction as its own thing, rather than a side quirk of another genre. I can't overstate how important, just how influential this period, this magazine was for the future vibe, direction and aesthetic of science fiction. The now ingrained images of rockets, robots and ray guns, even the font and the colour comes from Amazing Stories under the guidance of Hugo Gernsback. He also encouraged communication between fans through his letters page, connecting and growing a community of wonderful nerds and dorks across America. Maybe science fiction would have evolved into something similar to what we recognise today without Gernsback, maybe not, but he certainly started a chain of events that echo to this day. Unfortunately, Hugo's business sense wasn't as acute as his vision. He lost control of Amazing Stories due to a bankruptcy lawsuit in 1929. He dusted himself off and subsequently launched Science Wonder Stories and Air Wonder Stories, which quickly combined to become Wonder Stories, and a few years later commissioned the short-lived Science Fiction Plus. But Hugo's legacy will always be tied to those 3 years at Amazing Stories. He got the ball rolling and built the foundation for the wave that followed. And that's why the premier award for science fiction is called the Hugo... The Hugo. Hello, Moid of the Future here. I hope you're enjoying watching the video as much as we enjoyed making it. I know what you're all thinking. How can all this infotainment be free? How can I support the channel? Well, you can use Buy Me a Coffee, that's an online tipping service. You can buy merchandise at the merch store, or you can sign up for our Patreon and tell your friends you've joined a cult. All links are in the description of the video. Merci beaucoup. So the stage is set, the audience is warmed up, and the money is moving in the right direction. Science fiction is now a business. Enter John W. Campbell, a relatively successful science fiction writer from New Jersey who attracted the attention of Astounding Stories editor Fred Tremaine. Astounding Stories is one of the new batch of science fiction pulps which sprung up after Hugo's Amazing Stories. This is 1937, so we've had about a decade of this stuff at this point. Campbell was hired specifically to succeed Fred Tremaine as editor, and many regard the day that Campbell took charge as the dawn of the golden age of science fiction. We made a video about that as well. He edited his first issue of Astounding Stories in October 1937 and was given the keys to the castle, full control, April 1938. But why is John W. Campbell regarded with such esteem? Why is he the subject of this video? He wasn't the only science fiction editor in town. Remember we talked about the household names, the people whose words we read and love, the authors who actually make the magic. Campbell either published, promoted, supported, established, or discovered pretty much all of them from this era. The big three for a start: Asimov, Clarke and Heinlein, as well as Theodore Sturgeon, Simak, Herbert, Van Vogt, L. Ron Hubbard. L. Ron Hubbard?
Really?
Cut that bit out later. But more important than actually finding and presenting the talent, Campbell had a vision, a philosophy of what science fiction could and should be. I think he realised that the position of editor was a far more powerful tool than being a writer. He could handpick the stories and the authors that fit his personal ideology and mould the face of science fiction. So he did. Although Hugo Gernsback lifted science fiction onto its own pedestal, it still felt attached to the old systems. Back then, sci-fi was more like westerns in space, detective stories in space, soft porn in space. Campbell was focused on the bigger idea, the mentally stimulating, grown-up, philosophical approach, not the more basic pulp adventure. And his plan worked. He changed the style of Astounding Stories, it was successful, and pretty much everybody else changed too. He was not without his faults. I don't really care about anybody's personal business, but there were opinions and character traits that affected his work and arguably the genre as a whole. He was racist, there's no other way to say it really, and he ruled with an iron fist and had many enemies. Basically anybody that didn't conform to the Campbellian way. But he was undeniably a man that straddled and influenced science fiction for most of the 20th century. He threw out the old pulpy ways, nurtured and matured the genre, and then pissed off enough people to trigger the ushering in of the new wave. So here we have two men, the two most important people in all of science fiction, and it feels like we would really struggle to add another one to that list. It's not that science fiction has finished developing, it's not that it's impossible to have another hugely influential editor or author. That could happen. I understand that everything we experience artistically is standing on the shoulders of everything that came before, Our whole civilization is intrinsically interconnected. But the foundation and the big leap forward are behind us now. And I don't think that much power will ever be taken by or given to one individual ever again. There have been characters like Michael Moorcock and Harlan Ellison who spearheaded the new wave, and William Gibson could be labelled as the father of modern science fiction or something, but hardly anybody else from the literary world really jumps out. Now science fiction has to share an identity with film, TV and video games and board games, and it's a much bigger thing. Maybe the next big thing is just around the corner. Maybe it's you watching this video. Maybe it's me.
It's not you, Moid.